Welcome to the tutorial on differentiated instruction. This tutorial accompanies the class activities that we completed on stage 1 of unit design and how to differentiate in stage 1. This tutorial is meant to continue on to stages 2 and 3. So all this week we have been focusing on introducing you to differentiate instruction and very specific differentiated instruction techniques, and as they relate to the 3 different phases of the UBD unit planning process. We're also going to, in this tutorial, talk a little bit about pre-assessment and the role of pre-assessment, how vital it is to the process of differentiation. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the options that you have as a teacher and where you can be flexible and how you can provide different options for your students along the way. So let's talk a little bit about pre-assessment. Pre-assessment really is the first vital step in differentiation. I think, a key to differentiating effectively is really to know a lot about your students. And it's impossible to know a lot about your students in terms of their learning style and their academic readiness, the background knowledge they bring to the table, unless you do some kind of pre-assessment. So the first thing to think about is try to figure out exactly what you're going to pre-assess. It's really impossible for you to pre-assess all the knowledge and skills that are encompassed in your class. So it's important that you think about variance. And the best way to do that is for each unit, take a look at the items that you have, the learning objectives you have in the knowledge and skills section of your unit plan, and really ask yourself, where do you think the greatest degree of variance is going to be when it comes to the background knowledge of your students? Now, a lot of times this requires you to have some vertical understanding of the curriculum in your school and how one grade level works, transitions into the other, as well as relationships with your colleagues. So there is a lot of background work and a lot of legwork to be done with this decision. But I really think it's important that you really try to prioritize and really ask yourself and work with your colleagues in terms of people that taught your students the year before, and try to figure out which learning objectives will have the greatest degree of variance and really pinpoint your pre-assessment efforts in those particular knowledge and skills. So as a teacher, you have several different options in how you conduct your pre-assessment. One popular approach are graphic organizers. KWL charts are quite common. K standing for what students already know about a topic, W standing for what students want to know a topic, and L standing for what students have learned about a topic. So a really quick kind of fun pre-assessment technique is when you start a unit to tell students what the unit is about briefly and ask them to use this KWL chart to record what they feel they already know about the topic and what they want to know about the topic. And they can come back at the end of the unit and kind of a self-assessment to complete the third and final column, which is what they feel they've learned about the particular topic. Frere diagrams are also a good simple graphic organizer where it's a graphic organizer around a particular topic. So whatever the unit topic is written in the middle of the Frere diagram, and then students record, depending on how you want to organize your Frere, different facts about that topic, questions they have. If you Google Frere diagrams for a certain topic, you'll see many examples out there. Self-assessments are also something to think about. You can give students a self-assessment survey about the various topics in your unit and ask them to assess their own understanding and how much background knowledge they have about a particular topic. And last but not least, you can always have students quick write, where you just give them a topic and tell them basically to brainstorm and give them a set amount of time, let's say 3 minutes, and say write everything you know about that topic and use that as a pre-assessment. So once we've done our pre-assessment, there really are 2 major ways to use pre-assessment data. And let's split these into Gen Ed students as opposed to our IEP students that are working into our classes through inclusion. So on the gen ed side, you're really going to use pre-assessment for compacting, in the sense that you're going to be trying to find knowledge and skills that are priorities for your unit, but that you have pre-assessment data to show that these knowledge and skills may already be mastered. And that enables you to kind of take them out of your schedule and gives you more time to cover the things that the pre-assessment shows students do not have any background knowledge in. Now, for your IEP students, a little bit different. We had a conversation later on this week in how to differentiate in phase one of a UBD unit plan, where you learned how to unpack standards and create tiered outcomes for students. So in this situation, you can use those tiers to modify assessments. So based on the pre-assessment data, that's what you're going to use to really decide what tier a student is going to go into, and that's going to drive everything for the rest of your unit plan. All right, so let's focus now specifically on differentiation techniques for stage 2 in the unit design process, and that means we're going to be focusing on how you gather evidence of student mastery. So there really are two major ways to differentiate in phase 2 or in the assessment phase. And again, like we've said before, one is really specific to a gen ed situation where you're holding all students accountable to the same learning outcomes, as opposed to an inclusion model where you're going to unpack standards and have all students working under the same standard, but within that you're going to create tiers, a continuum of understanding for your IEP students. So on the gen ed side, you're really talking about format differentiation. You're going to be providing students with options, whether we're talking about oral assessments or multiple choice tests or open-ended kinds of things, and we'll talk about specific examples. But when you're talking about differentiation in the assessment phase for gen ed students, you're only talking about differentiating the format of the assessment as opposed to what the assessment is evaluating. Now, on the special education side for your IP students, you have more flexibility. So in addition to differentiating the format, you can also differentiate the actual building blocks or the evidence that students are going to exhibit to show understanding of a particular standard. So a little bit more flexibility there. So when you're talking about differentiating format, it's really going to be helpful for you to be very comfortable with creating different kinds of assessments. And we've already talked in this class about how to create good multiple choice test items versus constructed response versus performance tasks. And you see here on the slide, all the different kinds of assessment tools that you can use. So for gen ed students, you can use these different formats to differentiate towards students' learning styles or the kinds of assessments they might feel more comfortable with. Or, you can also give students options and let them decide. It's a great idea to have more than one assessment format for a unit, particularly when you're talking about summative assessments, and let the students choose which format they're more comfortable with. So let's talk about how that would work. So on the gen ed side, the first thing that you would do is start with the learning styles of your students. So through some kind of pre-assessment, a learning style inventory, you would know the learning styles of your students. And you would try to identify, let's say, 3 to 4 different assessment formats that address 3 to 4 different learning styles that exist in your class. And then over the course of your unit, create what we call a learning audit. So a series of different assessments, that each evaluate different knowledge and skills for your unit, but each are a different format, and each format appealing to a different learning style. And in this situation, every student would complete the entire audit. This would give students the opportunity to both work with assessment formats that really do match their learning style, that are very comfortable to them, as well as also stretching students and forcing them to work through other assessment formats, like, let's say, an oral exam that they may not be as comfortable with. Now, on the inclusion side of things, it's a little bit different, right? Now, we're assuming you've already differentiated in phase one of your unit. So you have your knowledge and skills and your standards unpacked, broken into tiers. So you're going to start by looking at the knowledge and skills for each tier or layer or whatever you want to call it. And you're going to create a different assessment for each tier or layer. Now, these assessments are going to be different, and they're going to assess different knowledge and skills, but all of them will be within a continuum that's under the particular standards that are in your unit. Now, we've already started talking about learning styles in terms of identifying assessment formats that align to student learning styles. But let's go more into depth about learning styles. And before we do that, I guess let's talk about what learning styles are usually confused with, and that's Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. The concept of multiple intelligence really was valuable in helping teachers understand that the concept of smart can take a lot of different forms. But learning styles are something different. Learning styles really are students' predisposition. What kinds of situations are most conducive for learning experience for those students. So let's talk specifically about learning styles as opposed to multiple intelligences. Now, there are a lot of different learning style theories or learning style inventories out there, and it's probably not a bad idea for you to take some time to research the various ones. We're going to talk about Myers-Briggs. It tends to be one of the more established and one of the most heavily used when it comes to academic research. So here's a graphic organizer that attempts to explain the Myers-Briggs definition of learning styles. Myers-Briggs is really defined by the interrelationship between two different ranges of tendencies. One range is students who learn by having to actually do something, feel it with their hands, act it out, as opposed to students who learn in a more abstract way by thinking about something in their heads. So feeling to thinking. The other range has to do with the relationship between social activity in the learning process. So on one end of the spectrum would be a student who's needs a highly social environment in order to learn, versus a student who needs a more solitary learning environment where they can be reflective to themselves. So if you look at this graphic organizer, you'll see 4 different quadrants, but you'll see each quadrant really is a different combination of these 2 ranges, feeling to thinking and social versus reflective. So let's talk about each of these 4 quadrants, because that's really what's going to help you understand these 4 different learning styles according to Myers-Briggs. So let's start with extrovert sensing, which tends to represent about 50% on average of the students in your class. So these are the students who have a lot of energy, they're highly social, they enjoy cooperative learning kinds of activities, high degrees of interpersonal skills. They tend to have very short attention spans. They can't sit there and listen to you talk for an extended period of time. Tend to enjoy visual kinds of activities and look for practical applications. These are the students that are always saying, so what, and why do we need to know this? Next, you have the introvert sensing learner, which tends to represent about 20% of your students. So, the introvert sensing learner is going to be more independent. They are going to have more solitary tendencies and be more intrapersonal as opposed to interpersonal, which means they're more self-reflective of themselves. They do seek practicality and seek application, so they are always asking that, why do we have to know this kind of thing? And they do tend to want to learn in more of a hands-on kind of way. They're not as intuitive, not as abstract, much more practical, but really have practical tendencies while working by themselves. The third quadrant we're going to look at is the extrovert intuitive, which represents another 20% of your class. These students are highly social, but very abstract and kind of live in their heads. These would typically be very gifted and bright students who also fare very well socially, intellectual kinds of students, but really tend to best function when they can visualize concepts in their head. Last but not least, we'll take a look at the introvert intuitive learner. So this tends to be a learner that learns best in a passive learning environment. They respond well to linguistic situations, which means they're listening to somebody else talk. They don't particularly thrive in social learning environments. They tend to shy away from cooperative learning kinds of activities. They embrace intellectual analysis kind of for the sake of intellectual analysis. They're not always looking for a practical application. I think that last phrase has it best. They tend to seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. These are students that really, have a tendency towards academia later on in their life. So if you look at what the research says about the various learning styles that exist in your classroom in terms of what learning styles are more common, you'll see by far the most common is the extrovert sensing. And the least common would be the introvert intuitive. And I think it's interesting to ask ourselves, what kinds of teaching do we see going on most of the time? And I've heard many of you say from your field experiences that you still see a tremendous amount of teacher-directed instruction going on. That classic passive learning situation where the teacher's doing all the talking and the students are sitting passively listening. And I think it's important for us to remember that while there's definitely a place for that, when we're teaching in that mode, we are really appealing mostly to the introvert intuitive student, which, as this graph shows, really is a very small percentage of our students. So I think it's important to know that if we're going to appeal to a larger percentage of our students and to their learning styles, we really need to develop instructional techniques beyond the lecture. It's also important to keep in mind that beyond learning style, many of you will also differentiate towards some kind of disability. You're going to encounter so many different kinds of disabilities in your career, and it really is, I think, imperative that you take time to do your homework and understand the types of disabilities that you might encounter in the classroom up front, how those disabilities manifest themselves, and what are some of the research-based techniques for helping students with those disabilities. And the ones you're seeing on this slide here are just some of the more common ones that I've seen in my career. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about differentiation techniques for stage 3 of your UBD unit plan, which is really going to involve the learning activities that you plan for students. So on the gen ed side of things, when you talk about differentiating learning activities, you're talking about options. And I think the best way to do that is kind of to go back to that Myers-Briggs bar graph where we broke down learning styles by common classrooms. That the graph that said that 50% of your students are extrovert sensing and 10% are introvert intuitive and so on and so on. So try to create learning paths that you think appeal to those 4 different learning styles, and try to create a combination that reaches at least 3/4 of your class, right? And again, the only way you'll know for sure how your class breaks down, you can't always assume that your class is going to break down into that 50, 20, 20, 10% breakdown, but by doing a learning style inventory up front as a pre-assessment, you'll be able to know how your class breaks out and create paths. You may not be able to hit every learning style, for every activity or every unit, but if you try to make an effort to create different learning activity options or different learning activity paths for at least 3/4 of your students, you'll be better than most. All right, so let's try this out, and you're going to be responding to the post titled "Stage 3 Options" for this week, and I want you to use the tables on pages 91 through 99 in your Differentiated Instruction in UBD book as a resource for this activity. So pull out your unit plan and pick any one of your learning activities, and I want you to explain to me the activity that exists there, as well as the learning style you feel that activity address. And then I would like you to again use the table to find at least one option for how you could differentiate that activity, and even more importantly, tell me the additional learning style, again in the Myers-Briggs definition, that new differentiated option addresses. Now, on the inclusion side of things are a little bit different. So again, you have more flexibility. So you've already tiered your learning outcomes in the knowledge and skills section of your unit plan. And you really want to take a look at each tier and create learning activities specific to that tier. So again, you're going to be using pre-assessment data to put students into tiers, and then you have the ability to create different learning activities for each tier. Last but not least, I think maybe more so than any other topic in this class, I think the best way for you to become really good at differentiating your instruction is to become a lifelong learner. And there are a lot of really good resources out there. One of them is a textbook that you already have, or that white book by Carol Ann Tomlinson, who really is like the grandmother of differentiated instruction, and Jay McTighe, who is one of the founders of the UBD style of instructional design. So that really was a landmark book of those two authors coming together and explaining how there are synergies between those two things. We've talked a little bit about tiering or layering. I would highly recommend Kathy Nunley's A Student Brain, or she has another book called Layered Curriculum. That's a really good book for understanding how to differentiate your unit plans, as well as the original The Differentiated Classroom by Carol Ann Tomlinson. So there's a lot of good sources out there, and I really think that it's important for you to continue to research and to learn new techniques for differentiated instruction. Hopefully this tutorial and the activities we did this week gave you a good start on that.